when you're ready to start.
Hello, welcome. I'm Tom Riccardi. I'm a volunteer with A Simple Gesture here in Guilford County. And today, for Giving Tuesday, or if you're watching this later on, we're going to be talking about the state of hunger in the area. As with this pandemic, and for other times as well, the state of hunger in Guilford County is always in flux and always a bit of concern. So we have some leaders from the community. They'll tell us more about just what we can do to help and how things work as far as the food supply chain goes and how your donations get to people with those in need. So I'll introduce our panel for today. First, we'll start with Emily McCollum. She's the food project coordinator for the Weaver Foundation. Good morning, Emily.
Good morning. Thank you, Tom. I'm happy to be here and thankful to be able to talk about the work that's happening, particularly right now. As you mentioned, we know that food security has been an issue in our community for a long time, but right now, in the wake of COVID-19, we're seeing an extreme need for food. And so it has been wonderful to see all the organizations and individuals that are working together to make sure that there's food available for those who need it.
And tell me a little bit about the Weaver Foundation.
Certainly. So we're a small family foundation that funds in the greater Greensboro area, and the Weaver family has been supportive of this community for over 50 years. And in the past 4 years or so, we've really been focused on the issue of food security, focusing a lot of our funding as well as our time and effort into helping out in any way that we can around the issue of food security in our community.
Also joining us is Carl Vierling. He's the executive director of the Greater High Point Food Alliance. Good morning, Carl.
Morning, Tom. How are you doing?
Good. And tell us a little bit about the High Point Food Alliance.
So we're a grassroots initiative that started when the Greensboro High Point MSA was ranked #2 in the nation in food hardship. And then we moved to #1. So we're this organization that works with community members and neighborhoods, taking a very 50,000-foot view of food insecurity and how we can bring the pieces together to actually solve the issue, moving people to where they're sustainable by working with 4 neighborhoods in the High Point area, 4 of the poorest neighborhoods in North Carolina, actually. And then by asking the question, how would you help us solve the issue of food insecurity? And working with those neighborhoods to come up with plans and going to the community. We also have taken a very broad approach with our work teams doing food access, urban agriculture, food education, policy and advocacy, seniors, and then we also created something called Food Security Fund, where we will actually fund sustainable projects, which has been really good. So it's truly a grassroots initiative, but it's about how do you actually solve the problem by bringing the resources together. And in this time, what we have seen is just a tremendous increase in the demand on the system. And how do we bring all the right resources? How do we work together? And what are the communities that might be forgotten in the midst of all this? Because we have so many pockets of poverty in Guilford County. The 27260 zip code in High Point is one of the poorest in the state of North Carolina, for example. And that's also where we're seeing a lot of the positive cases of COVID-19.
And we'll touch on that in a bit. And we'll say hello to Leslie Isakoff, Executive Director of A Simple Gesture. Good morning.
Good morning, Tom. Thank you for hosting this, and thank you to Emily and Carl for being a part of this. For those of you who don't know, A Simple Gesture was created in 2015 in response to this area being named one of the hungriest metropolitan areas in the country. So we work very closely with the Weaver Foundation and the Greater High Point Food Alliance, as well as 11 food pantries and several other food organizations across the county. So we're so grateful to Emily and Carl for being here, and Tom for moderating this. And thank you to everyone who's interested in finding out more about food security and what's happening during this time.
And before we get into the main idea of this panel, Leslie, can you elaborate further on the term food desert? That's something that I heard many times, especially when starting out with the Simple Gesture and moving to Guilford County. And Carl alluded to it a little bit ago. what is a food desert, and how does that, where does Guilford County rank as far as that? And it's one of the reasons why we're here today.
Yes, so hunger is usually thought about by two factors, food accessibility and food affordability. So Guilford County struggles with both of those. Food is both unaffordable for many people in this area, and it's also inaccessible. So we don't have the best transport in this area. Food can be very difficult to get to, even though we're living in a more urban area. So that continues to be a major problem of just accessibility. That's where the term food desert comes from. But what we're seeing during COVID-19 across the country and across the world is food is becoming more and more unaffordable for families that are losing their job. Their financial situation has changed, but also we're going to see food prices increasing, and that's already happened, but they're going to continue to increase. So food is going to become more and more unaffordable, increasing hunger around the world.
All right, I'll start with Carl, and then Emily and Leslie, feel free to jump in to add any more to this question. So in the news lately, we've seen long lines of cars arriving at food banks in Pennsylvania, California. Is that happening to us locally? What is happening locally as far as food banks, people, demand?
Okay. Well, let's make a distinction between a food bank and a food pantry. A food bank is this massive organization, typically with Feeding America, that's actually a supplier to the food pantries. So there is that distinction. And in some communities, it is the food banks that are serving. In our local community, it's actually the food pantries and other food providers. And while they get a lot of the food from Second Harvest Food Bank in Winston-Salem, it actually flows through the food pantries. So what we have seen so far among the food pantries is some of them have doubled and tripled the number of people that they're serving. And at the same time, they've had this explosion in need. The number of donations that they can get have actually dwindled, because a lot of these food pantries have contracts or agreements with local grocery stores like Harris Teeter and Publix and Food Lion to pick up the food. Well, because there's been so much consumer demand, the amount of food that they can pick up from these stores has dramatically decreased. Also, because there's not as much food in the grocery stores, it's harder to do food drives. So you're seeing, it's like having a very long summer. In the summertime, our food pantries see a dramatic increase in need. At the same time, the donations drop off. And that's what we're seeing right now. So they have more than doubled. There are more requests. And there have also been more challenges coming to light because the issue of transportation and also culturally appropriate foods being available. That's another big issue that we're really just now getting into.
So it's almost as if we're being pulled at both sides at this point.
3 sides at one time, actually.
Yes. Emily, what do you see on your end as far as demand going for food banks and food pantries?
Well, I think the demand is significant, like Carl mentioned, and I've had the opportunity to work with our local school system as are working to provide food through pickup sites, because in Guilford County, we have 73,000 students, and about 65% of those receive free and reduced lunch whenever school is in session. So imagining how many families that impacts, where a significant portion of the nutrition and food for a child comes from their school breakfast and lunch. And so what I'm seeing is that our school system has acknowledged this issue and is providing meals at over 115 or so sites throughout our county. And what we're seeing at those sites is lots of people coming to pick up food, getting breakfasts and lunches in a drive-through fashion. And then also a number of nonprofits working to provide supplemental weekend food at some of those sites so that families can have food over the weekend. And so we're definitely seeing increased need there, as well as we have organizations that are serving out in the community, providing mobile markets, providing food in lots of different ways. And those lines that you mentioned, we're seeing that, lines down the road, lines blocking roads as folks are waiting to pick up food.
And Leslie, on the hyperlocal end, to the individual donors, what are you seeing?
Yeah, so a simple gesture, the way that we support local food pantries is by asking people to fill up a bag full of food and then just leave food on their front porch. And we pick up from about 4,500 individuals, either at their home or their work. Unfortunately, donations have dropped off significantly. And we're hearing two things. Either people's financial situation has changed, so they can't afford to give anymore, or they're worried about getting out into grocery stores. Both are 100% legitimate, and we understand that. But we're having a hard time getting the food that's needed to local pantries. We are also seeing food insecurity is just going off the charts. So on February 29th, North Carolina was experiencing about 17% food insecurity. By March 31st, and Carl, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was at 41%.
It was.
So we haven't gotten the numbers for April, but we're expecting that it's going to increase significantly again. So we're just having a really hard time getting the food that we need to local pantries. Yeah.
And Leslie, can you define what food insecurity is?
Food insecurity is not having the money or ability to get the food that you need to feed your family.
Okay. So is there like a particular threshold, or it's just a terms of means that is different from person to person, family to family?
Carl, can you expand on that?
There's actually a definition that the USDA uses. There's a set of criteria that if you answer positive on any of these things, then you're identified as being food insecure. And well, Leslie's right. It is having access to the food that you and your family need to work, play, to worship. It's not just food, it's nutritional food. That's the other component. It's got to be nutritional food. So it's really about access.
So there could be a number of people that are food insecure that just don't know it yet, or just purchasing food that isn't really necessarily good for them.
Well, a great example of that is in a food desert, you don't have grocery stores. I look at Guilford County, there are 24 food deserts. 7 of those are actually in the High Point area. So if you're in a low income and at least 1 mile away from a full grocery store like a Harris Teeter or a Walmart, something like that, then you're in a food desert. And what we see in Guilford County, at least in the High Point area, is that where you have a food desert, you also have a healthcare desert. There are no healthcare providers, right? So you see these areas that have this tremendous need, but they also don't have access to the healthcare system. And Leslie and Emily are both right about transportation. That's one of the biggest issues that we face as communities.
And we know that a healthy lifestyle and healthy eating certainly go hand in hand, and when one drops off, the other may as well. Emily, as the number of unemployed persons in North Carolina increase, do you think our food banks and our government, what can they do to meet the increased demand for food?
Well, I think it takes us continuing to work at it from all angles. I mean, we do see from the government standpoint, folks who get what was known as food stamps or EBT benefits, there have been increases in North Carolina for those, particularly for families who have children who typically receive free and reduced lunch at schools. And there's a pandemic EBT benefit that has been added, which is really important for families to have more money to purchase the food. I will quote Leslie on saying, we can't food pantry our way out of hunger. It requires government support as well. And so I think it's important that we both consider donating in any ways that we can to local food pantries, supporting our food bank and the food that they're receiving and getting out to pantries. But then it's also important that we reach out to our legislators and that we say that, you know, our government does have to step in this area and help people with the support that they need to purchase the food that they need for their families.
Do you see an increase in support from the government, less or about the same in the last 3 months?
Well, I think that when we have a crisis, people are able to come together in ways that we aren't able to at other times. So, you know, Carl and Leslie can share their opinions here too, but I do think, you know, we have seen support coming out from the federal government and the local government providing additional food money for food and support for our food banks. And then I also think that there are some things that we need to work on. I mean, North Carolina is struggling. We haven't expanded Medicaid in North Carolina, and that's been on the table for a long time. And even in this time of crisis, we haven't found a way to do that. So to Carl's point around healthcare and food going hand in hand, I think we really have to consider the bigger picture there, and how do we, you know, encourage our legislators to support the whole person, which includes not only the food to eat, but also the healthcare needs.
I can add to that if you don't mind. So the government generally provides about 92% of all food aid, and every food pantry and food bank and faith community only is contributing to that last 8%. So a lot of times what we're lacking to end food insecurity in any country is the political will to do it. There's enough food to feed everyone, and enough food to feed everyone a very nutritious, give them a nutritious lifestyle and a nutritious diet. So we got very close in the 1960s to ending hunger with our war on poverty, and a lot of those programs have been cut back and cut back. What we saw in March, where that really concerned me at all the food pantries, is there was a lag of government response to the crisis, especially in nutrition. So when the stimulus package came out, when the pandemic EBT came out, that was a huge help to local pantries. However, there was a push to expand SNAP benefits or food stamps by 15%. And that did not pass Congress in the last stimulus bill. So I would echo what Emily says, is that we need to continue to ask our legislators to really push for food aid. The World Food Program just today said that they project that hunger will double around the world in the next 6 months. Starvation is going to become a major issue throughout the world. What we see, what history tells us, is that when hunger increases, political stability drastically decreases. The World Food Program is warning that we may have some major political issues throughout the world in the coming months. So food aid needs to be at the top of every politician's mind, both locally, statewide, nationally, and globally.
I would think that aside from political instability coming with hunger would be social instability as well.
Oh, yeah.
Carl, how do you see things at High Point as far as support from local officials?
We're working with them, trying to continue to get them engaged. I think they're very supportive of what we're doing. But one of the things that we're lacking right now is we're working so hard to meet the immediate crisis that we're planning for 6 and 9 and 12 months out. This is a short-term event. If they're correct that there's a second wave, that means that people will be laid off again. We've got businesses that are closing that will never open again. We need to be thinking about the long-term implications of this and how we actually respond to it. While the pandemic EBT card is really good for families with children, it's 2 payments, from what I understand. It's a short-lived program. Well, those kids are still going to be out of school come July and August. There's still going to be a demand on the family. So I think we need to be bringing people together. and say, what's our strategy going forward? How are we going to respond to this in the month of August and November? How are we going to respond to it in February? Where's the food going to be? How are we going to fund this? How are we going to work together as communities? And the one thing that happens sometimes is that we're so focused on our local community that we miss that there's a much, much bigger issue. You know, oftentimes, at least for us, this is a Piedmont Triad issue, right? And Leslie was talking about food insecurity for North Carolina. The average food insecurity rate for the United States was 12% prior to March. At the end of March, it was 38%. It tripled. It tripled in the country. And so I think our local officials, our state officials, and national officials, we need to be having an honest, and I mean honest, conversation about the days ahead and how do we prepare for it. And Leslie and Emily and I always say this: if you're going to have a train wreck, plan it. We are going to have a train wreck if we're not planning for it.
And that brings me into the next topic when it comes to planning down the road and how the supply chain is going to react, because we may not be seeing the effects right now about how the supply chain is affected. That's something a couple months down the road. So Leslie, how is food produced in the US getting to grocery stores, and challenges that are going to be coming over the horizon? What should we be aware about those challenges? How will the supply chain be affected?
Yeah, so we're already starting to see a lot of these supply chain issues. There's definitely a fracture in the supply chain. So what you need for a good supply chain is healthy workers. And what we're seeing is most farmers, 1 in 5 farmers, whether they're pickers or transportation, whatever, wherever they are, they work very closely with each other. So you're seeing major outbreaks within the farming community. Then, so that's one point of stress. The second point of stress is there's a lot of transportation that happens with all of our food, getting from a farm to a place to that it's processed to the grocery store. Places where it's being processed, there's also several outbreaks. So you've started to see this in the news where places like Smithfield and Tyson are having to shut down plants because there's so many people getting COVID-19. I know the Tyson plant in Wilkesboro just had a major outbreak these last 2 weeks. So those are beginning to shut down. So we're going to start to see some kind of food rationing at local grocery stores. You'll start to see that you can only buy 1 or 2 packages of certain things. You may not see it at all. Food stamps, or EBT, is considered a major food rationing system. So it gives people a certain amount that they can spend on groceries. So that'll be happening. We're also on a more global scale, Tom, we're starting to see kind of some food nationalism start to happen. So some countries like China are starting to store up their food and not export as much. Places like Vietnam has decided to stop exporting rice. Kyrgyzstan, which is the major wheat exporter in the world, has stopped many of those exports. In addition, many of the ports that food comes in and out of throughout the world are beginning to close because of COVID-19. So the bottom line, I think, is that food system depends on healthy people. But the food system is so vulnerable because you're seeing migrant workers, you're seeing people that are involved in transportation that are getting COVID-19 very quickly, and then they're having to shut a lot of that down. So we're going to start seeing a lot of shortages.
So with that being said, is there a local solution or some sort of measure to mitigate that problem?
Yeah.
And Leslie, I'll start with you, and then if Emily and Carl want to jump in after that, please do.
I might toss this ball to Carl because he has been a huge proponent of local gardening for a long time. So I'm going to toss this to Carl.
That's a great question. And You know, we get 90% of our lettuce and greens from the West Coast. All it takes is a blip in the system. So what if we started doing things more locally? One of the things we have a lot of in Guilford County, we have a lot of empty warehouse space, a lot of empty factories. How do we convert that into food production using aquaponics, hydroponics, whatever it may be, get it closer to the source? The other thing is that we've got urban farmers that are doing amazing work within our cities. And how do we continue to develop policies for them? How do we continue to develop programs where they have a way of selling? We see Growing High Point's a great example of what urban farmers can do. They've actually created their own food hub, and they're in the process of creating a co-op. They're selling at the market. And then individually, we can go back to gardening in our backyard. Now, I'm not a gardener, but this is the first year in years and years and years I've actually put in a garden, because I want to make sure that we have enough, whatever that may be, and also to share with my neighbors. So the more we can do locally, the better off we're going to be, and we won't be as vulnerable to all these supply chain disruptions. All it is a crisis, a hurricane, a tornado, a pandemic, and your chain is disrupted. So the closer we can get to the source, the better off that we will all be, not just for food, but for a whole lot of different products.
And then the byproduct of that would be, let's say you do start a community garden. The first word, community, is what brings people together. And personally, in this crisis, I'm getting to know my neighbors. I haven't been in this neighborhood for very long, but I've gotten to know my neighbors real quick. And something like a community garden would help, or growing your own and giving it to neighbors. But some also live in apartments and may not have that option. So the idea of having local centers, like you mentioned about warehouses and whatnot, becoming food production centers is a fantastic idea. Now, what about I've seen some other stories on the news of excess food being dumped, especially from produce farmers, dairy farmers, having dump their milk. My first thought is, why can't that be donated? And I'm sure there's a really good answer. I just don't know what that is. Can you speak on that, Emily?
I can start and then others can join in, but you're right. We see those, onions in the ditches, and those who work with people who are hungry, you're like, can we just get that food? On the other hand, what we know is that it's a challenge in so many different ways. And so, how do we transport something from Idaho to where it's needed somewhere else? That's an issue. And Leslie was speaking to that as far as the supply chain. Also, when you think about all of the food pantries, food banks, faith communities who are providing food being 8% of, the food, meeting 8% of the food need, the capacity for distributing that food is not there. So if a farm that produces tons and tons and tons of onions needs to distribute that, well, the organizations that are currently giving food out to those who need it don't have the capacity to take tons of onions and distribute them throughout a community. So I think there's a lot of different challenges. I mean, and we're seeing that, we see milk being dumped, we see lots of different places where, yes, there is food waste, but it goes back, I think, to that systems piece, and the structures are not in place for distributing that any differently than they have been distributed all along. So when the current method of distribution is broken and the need isn't there, and they don't have anywhere to deliver that tanker of milk, that's where our breakdown is. We don't have another way to get that out to folks. And so I think we really have to locally and as a nation and a world think about what are other ways to distribute that food. Carl, Leslie, do you have any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in if you don't mind, Carl. So in February, 53% of our food system was for commercial feeding. So that means it went to cafeterias and restaurants and places where people bought food in bulk. So many of the places that we process food is intended for people to buy lots and lots of it. So those processing places, many of them are shutting down because they have workers with COVID-19. But the second big issue is that they are having to decide, should they retool so they can package so food is intended for individual feeding. And that is very expensive and it takes a long time. So and nobody knows how long this is going to be. So that's a very difficult decision that many processors are having to make. And since that food can't be processed, there's really nowhere for that food to go. So that's been another major system breakdown. Carl, do you have anything to add?
So I think the other challenge is that we rely in this country on migrant workers that pick the crops. So if there are restrictions on them as far as travel, if they're struggling with COVID-19, which a lot of them are, then we have the help that we need to actually get the crops out of the field and into the processing. And Leslie's right about the processors, but also it goes back to the workers and whether they're able to help pick the crop or not.
So all around, it's just, it seems like there's a lot of worry and a little bit of gloominess, but there are ways that we can help. So I'll go around the horn again and I'll keep it on you, Carl. Ways to help during the crisis, and you can speak to your own organization and even go to the 50,000 foot view as well.
Okay, so I think organizations that are working together, partner with them, right? You don't have to go out and do this on your own. Partner with somebody that's already doing the work because they've got the resources and they've got the knowledge. Looking at this from a 50,000 foot view, consider the whole community. And one of the things that we are often missing is that we don't realize how diverse Guilford County is. We've got 112 languages in our school system. We're an extremely diverse community. So to bring all the pieces together, who do we bring to the table to get feedback from? Who are we asking the questions of? And it's just as important in my view is who are we holding accountable? Who's being held accountable for decisions that are being made? There's no reason for us to struggle as much. And I would encourage anybody to donate to any of these good organizations or volunteer your time. Volunteers, that's been another break in the system, has been the volunteers, because a lot of them are elderly, they don't want to get out, which is understandable. But what is it that your passion is, and how can you connect with an organization that shares your passion? And then financial donations, they're always appreciated, always needed, but involved, and even in your own neighborhood. A real quick story. My next door neighbor went around to several neighbors, and he had 3 or 4 rolls of toilet paper asking people if they needed toilet paper. Those acts of kindness mean more right now than anybody could possibly imagine. It's acts of kindness. We don't have to be bitter. We don't have to be divisive. We just need to be good neighbors.
Emily.
Well, Carl, I think you covered so much of it, supporting local organizations that are doing work in the food space, both with financial resources and if you have the ability to volunteer. We're fortunate here in Guilford County to have the Volunteer Center, which is currently capturing needs around COVID for nonprofit organizations. So it's kind of a one-stop shop for looking for volunteer opportunities. Greater High Point Food Alliance you can reach out to them to learn about some opportunities in High Point. So there are ways to learn about volunteering. And I just want to second Carl's helping your neighbor and expanding on who you think of as your neighbor is so important. And then being aware of the larger systems issues and what are the things that we can do to reach out to hold our decision makers accountable, and then to also share our opinions and thoughts on what decisions should be made.
Yeah, they both focused on a lot of the things that I was going to say. Just to add to what they are saying, from a national and state and even global level, I would really encourage everybody to advocate and reach out to your representatives and tell them how important food aid is at this time, to really make that a priority. The second is in thinking about your neighbors, I wanted to share a story about a woman that stopped by my office the other day. She had an increase in the number of or the amount of food stamps that she got this month. And she said that she was just fine on her regular amount. So she took her extra food stamps, bought the food, and then donated it. And to me, sometimes people giving out of a place that is really hard is some of the most heartwarming and wonderful things that I see. So we kind of gave a dire picture today of what the food system is going to look like in the next couple of months. And I really encourage everyone to kind of tighten their belts a little bit. And when they're buying, don't just think about themselves, but think about the entire community. I fear people hoarding food in a time where it's so desperately needed by everybody. The third thing, A Simple Gesture has been inundated with volunteers, so we are pushing everybody to go to the volunteer center. But if you can't get out and you can't go to the grocery store, we do have an Amazon wish list. So you can go buy food on Amazon, and that's delivered to us. And we keep our finger on the pulse of what's being done and what pantries need food the most. So we get those to where it's needed. So if you want to stay at home, which we are incredibly appreciative of everyone staying home, go to Amazon. Amazon Smile, there's a charity wish list for A Simple Gesture. You can buy food there and we'll get it to who needs it.
And Emily, I'll give you a chance to plug the Weaver Foundation one more time.
Well, I think for us, we are really fortunate to be in a supportive role. So thank you, Tom. And I just want to say, what I have seen in our community, there is this dire picture of our food system and what may come, but there's also a really inspiring, it's just been really inspiring seeing people supporting one another, whether it's organizations working together, whether it's individuals like the one that Leslie mentioned who are willing to give in whatever way that they can. So I just am thankful for those folks and encourage everyone to continue to support this effort in our community, not only here though, but nationally and globally.
And Carl, a plug to bring the High Point community together.
So I tell you what, in the midst of everything, I have been more blessed just to see the responses to what's going on. The fact that we had systems in place to help other organizations to be that support. We have a High Point Food Finder app that's being used throughout the county. And wouldn't have ever thought 5 years ago when we put that in, it would get so much usage. It's just the little things. For us, the biggest win has been the relationships that we've been building for the last 5 years. Relationships with the Weaver Foundation, A Simple Gesture, and all these other organizations. Those relationships have been key to getting things accomplished. Because we can't do this by ourselves. We really can't. It's about networking together.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. And if you're watching, whether it's on Giving Tuesday or another time, thank you for consuming all this information. Hopefully you'll be able to get involved for the people watching on Facebook. Carl Vierling, Executive Director of the Greater High Point Food Alliance. Thank you very much. Emily McCollum, Food Project Coordinator for the Weaver Foundation. And Leslie Isakoff, Executive Director of A Simple Gesture. This won't be the last time we'll be getting some community leaders together to discuss what is going on with our food supply, food bank, food pantries in the area. So we plan on keeping you updated for the rest of the year at least, and as this crisis continues. Thank you for all your help, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.